Statistically, I have found that people who pay attention to inner work resonate and identify more with the anxious than they do the avoidant. Someone may ask me, well, why is that? It's because the anxious is more prone to taking emotional feedback because they themselves are so emotional and they have no problem accessing their like emotional intensity or emotional selves, or like any discussions they want to have around it, because emotions for them are comfortable. So they are more likely to get into personal development spaces around relationships and around emotions because they're okay and happy to talk about it. Now, we all know the avoidant doesn't really feel comfortable talking about their deep emotions, right? The avoidant has such a heavy heavy stigma attached to anything that's emotional intensity, and this comes primarily from their childhood. The fact that when they really wanted love, care, connection with people, they were met with massive levels of shame and rejection, things that we don't actually think about. But it's why now, when they get into partnerships with people, especially with the anxious, they get into partnerships with people, whenever they're exposed to emotional intensity, avoidants freak out. So when it comes to inner work, they're not really going to participate as much because inner work means more discovery, more conversation around their emotions, and that's not something they necessarily dive into. When you identify as an anxious, here's the problem. What are the biggest wounds an anxious person has? They have the abandonment wound and the rejection wound. Actually, all of us have those pretty common wounds, but they show up very differently. So for an anxious person, they have the threat of abandonment always living just below the surface. They have the fear of like someone breaking up with them and them being alone literally just below the surface, and it's living there, eating them up inside. So what they want to do is they continuously want to cling to a relationship because it gives them a false sense of safety. Remember, the word here, false, is very key because the true sense of safety comes from within. Attaching to the external gives us a temporary sense of safety. So that's what tends to happen, for example, with the anxious. Now, the same anxious person, if they want continuously to be in a relationship because this gives them that sense of safety, saying they're not alone, they're not going to be abandoned, they will be chosen, they will be, they'll have something, then now, because the relationship they want so badly, they unconsciously will give up more of themselves, abandon more of themselves, accept more bullshit behavior, or accept more of the red flags just so they can stay in a relationship. So these people end up attracting avoidance, naturally, and vice versa. Avoidance end up attracting anxious people. It generally happens in the opposite spectrum until you get more towards security. And when they attract avoidance, they attract these individuals who don't necessarily respect their space and time, who don't necessarily respect their own emotional intensity, because avoidants have no idea of themselves. Avoidants keep pulling away. Avoidants keep withdrawing. Avoidants keep locking their emotions up in a cupboard. Avoidants may play a game somewhere else. But what has stopped the anxious from actually having the conversation and saying, hey, this is not working out, I'm going to step away? Sure, the anxious has probably had the conversation saying, hey, I would love more, I'd like this relationship to improve, but they haven't made that final decision. And this is because of their massive fear of losing the relationship. Now, here's what typically happens. When the relationship ends, obviously the anxious people are upset and frustrated, and the relationship didn't work out. And at that point, your ego wants you to blame the avoidant completely and say, I put all my best years of my life into this person, I put all my time into this space with this individual, and they couldn't really show up for me emotionally, they weren't really there 100%. That is your ego just projecting onto the external. It's blaming the external so that you don't have to work on the internal aspect yourself, you don't have to work on that healing, but what happens next, you attract the exact same fucking relationship the next time around. So blaming an external circumstance, especially when a particular relationship situation is not working, is not helpful. You can attribute the responsibility to that individual, so both parties have a part to play in any relationship. You can attribute responsibility. You can even hold them accountable or ask them to be more accountable, but you cannot blame, shame, project, or judge your wounds upon them because they've left you with pain. This is one of the biggest problems of what the anxious and the avoidant do when they get into relationships. Both of them are unconsciously projecting their own wounds onto each other, proving to themselves, oh my God, you're like every other person I dated. And so they're never going to find that true love that they really want. They're always going to be working at that peripheral distance space, challenging and triggering each other. In both stories, both of them, the anxious and the avoidant, had such strong childhood conditioning and wounds. They had very similar wounds, but they showed up differently. So when I put out posts about conversations with anxious or avoidance, So many of the anxious or past anxious folks will comment or resonate or respond with being like, why should we give them space? Why should we be so like, accommodating? Here's the thing. When you identify as someone who feels more secure inside, you will give both parties, whether it's an anxious person or an avoidant person, you will give both of them patience. You will be able to consider both of them and what they need. However, here's the big fucking difference. When you feel more secure inside, while you're giving, let's say, an avoidant more space, and you see that, okay, they're not emotionally connecting and stuff as much, you're not like jumping upon them, you also have strong internal boundaries, which someone who identifies with the anxious attachment does not have. So if you feel more secure and you feel like your avoidant partner is taking you for granted too much, they're pulling away too much, they're stretching their excuses all over the place for not really showing up with emotional connection, then you, as a secure person, are like, you know what? I don't think this is really going to work out. I did my best. I tried to show up, and I don't think this is really going to work out here because I think I deserve more. And normally and naturally, that's what I want and I want to connect with. Hey, and welcome to the Inner Yats YouTube page. If you like our content, make sure you click the like and the subscribe button so that you get more of these amazing videos that keep coming your way.